Okay, so this is Vapes4Vets, and it's brought to us today by Namaste Technologies. Um, my name is Dylan Battle, and this is Dr. Richard Shore. Hi, doctor.
Hello, Dylan.
How are you today?
Good, good. Beautiful day.
Yeah, it's a beautiful day. Whereabouts are you?
I'm in um, sort of Fort Rouge area.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, it has been a nice day today. So you are a clinical psychologist.
Yes.
So, sorry. So, and you work mainly with veterans.
No, I work, I'm in private practice and I work in the area. I do work with PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, um, regardless of the reason. It could be a sexual assault, it could be veterans, it could be paramedics, people that work in prisons. um, Anybody that's been subjected to a traumatic event. But I also work with anxiety, depression, relationship difficulty, so the whole range of adult disorders. But I do see quite a bit of PTSD.
Have you noticed that you've seen more PTSD lately, or is it pretty consistently something that clinical psychologists deal with a lot?
I'm seeing a lot more of it, and I think it's because of public awareness. There was a time when it was considered it could only happen in war. Combat veterans were really the only time, going back to the First World War when it was called being shell shocked, and then they had a lot of other sort of descriptions, but they were always very negative. And now we have one that's more accurate description because it's a traumatic reaction that happens after the trauma, so post traumatic stress disorder, and the body trying to return to a state of normalcy after being essentially shocked by experiencing something that is beyond the normal experience of the individual.
It's very. I've always wondered why is it like why is that the body's kind of like it's associated with so many negative effects, and so I've always wondered why the body does do that. Why is that the way that it decides to cope with traumatic events?
Well, and sometimes it can be a single event, and other times it can be a buildup of smaller events that finally the coping mechanisms have run out, and then the person feels a degree of helplessness in one case, or that they've experienced emotions that they're not comfortable with because of the massive amount of stimulation. It's like um, a fuse blowing, that your nervous system is wired to accept a certain amount of stress. And when it goes beyond that, it'll start a syndrome where certain parts of the brain are going to focus on negative memories because there's a consistent feeling that there's a threat to the body, even past the traumatic event. A lot of people don't realize that they're experiencing a trauma until it's over. Like combat vets might not realize that they have PTSD until they get back home and realize that the amount of arousal they needed to stay alive is not useful in everyday life. But because it's a lower part of the brain that first gets affected, the fight or flight response, um, the body will do something called an amygdala hijacking, which means that when a triggering event happens, it bypasses the higher intellect and keeps the emotion at a lower level, which makes sense if you see a bear, you don't want to start thinking about, oh, look how cute the bear is as it's running towards you. So you're more likely to survive if all of the energy the adrenaline is pumping towards the larger muscles to get you out of there.
So your
But
body almost becomes like rewired to respond to the stress of combat, and then brings that back into the normal world.
Right. And that you find that you can't calm down as easily because you kind of rewired the brain. And in fact, under MRI investigations, you can see that there's, in combat vets, there was a study done that showed that there's enlargement in certain areas of the brain, especially the areas that are responsible for retaining memory,
Wow.
because somebody with PTSD is constantly accessing memory to see if it's safe, because every other part of your body is saying there's danger here. What could it be? And so the body will produce a fight, flight, or freeze response. So the fight or flight most people know about, but humans can also freeze like deer in the headlights.
Okay.
And it's because you're overstimulated. There's just too much danger that I can't really even understand what it is. And I might react without thinking, because in combat, or say a paramedic who is experiencing trauma, because it's more than was expected. Or it could be over a prolonged period of time that you're able to hold back thinking about what happened earlier. But after a while, it builds up that you can't shut it off. And if treatment isn't obtained quickly enough, then you start to develop certain patterns of avoidance, for example, staying away from anything that could trigger you. So people, in severe cases, can become agoraphobic, where they're afraid to leave the house because they don't know what could trigger them.
Okay. That's a question I was gonna ask you, if there were like preventative measures that could be taken to prevent or lower severity of PTSD, or if that's only really something you can do with what you were talking about like somebody building up and retaining a stress and that over time turning into something else.
Well, a lot of it depends on how it's handled. So what one person finds as a traumatic event, another person might not. And sometimes it's hard to find out why is that. Two people can experience things differently, but it usually comes down to previous life experience, um, um, how well they handle stress. But some of the events are so out of everyday living for the individual. Uh, Being a combat vet is the easiest to use as an example, where one day um, you've rewired yourself to be able to use lethal force and be okay with it, and then the next day you're back home, and now you're supposed to readjust to you can't use lethal force. And then there's also the other effects of PTSD, which are the flashbacks, feeling of re-experiencing, where you actually believe for a period of time that you are back in that dangerous situation. So you can logically say, no, I'm home, I'm safe, but your nervous system is telling you, no, there is a danger. So you start to develop coping mechanisms, and sometimes they can be unhealthy coping mechanisms, um, like drinking alcohol, for example, is used quite often because it dulls the emotional response. But then you never adapt, you never learn how to deal with the response. So although alcohol works, it's not really a recommended treatment approach because you're avoiding. And anything that happens to uh, make or contribute to avoidance, you're less likely to improve.
Is
You
alcohol
need to be able
something
to expose yourself.
is alcohol something that is like commonly used as a self-medication for PTSD?
Yes, yes, it's um, and also with social anxiety, that a lot of people that appear to have social anxiety, scared to go out in public because of what people might think, is often there's often an element of PTSD, and it could be a trauma that happened 20, 30 years ago, or it could be something that, because it was so avoided, so repressed, that they don't think about it for years until one day they have a flashback. Something triggers them, and suddenly, like in one case, a woman who was sexually assaulted by an uncle, she was in her early 70s, and she suddenly remembered that this had happened. and then started to have all the effects of PTSD. So it can be held for years and the person not really understand it. And a lot of times, as I say, there is alcohol involved because it does take away some of the emotion. But alcohol is a depressant, and so it could result in, dependence on something that's going to depress you. It also disinhibits you. So we see a lot of rage, which is part of PTSD, because you're not able to uh, moderate your emotions. The example I use is um, before you had kind of a dial for your emotions. So you can go anywhere from 1 to 10, depending on the severity. With PTSD, it becomes a switch. You're either relaxed or you're highly energized.
Would people who grew up in a environment that was highly stressful, so if the environment that these military veterans were coming back from and they're experiencing post-traumatic stress from, would children who are born and raised in those same environments, like who live in those countries, are they also experiencing high symptoms of PTSD, or is it because they've been born into that and that's really kind of what their nature has been? Um, do they experience it less?
Well, it would depend on the situation. If children are exposed to, say, a parent that is manifesting a lot of PTSD-like symptoms, they wouldn't necessarily develop PTSD, but they could develop, say, an anxiety disorder or depressive disorder because their environment has become highly unpredictable, and their father is acting irrationally. So they could develop some fears, um, and it is possible that they could develop a vicarious post-traumatic stress disorder because they start to fear their environment because of the unpredictability. If they see that their father or mother is showing a lot of rage, um, then they could develop fear of father losing it, and so they could develop into PTSD. A lot of it has to do with how quickly we can get intervention and help people not go in the direction of um, uh, maladaptive coping mechanisms like using alcohol, which is one of the main uh, drugs. Cocaine and drinking usually will go together as well because um, once they're drinking, they feel like they need something to bring them up. And so that's how, that kind of dependency on drugs um, essentially serves as an avoidance amongst other uh, drawbacks to those using those drugs. But you avoid dealing with the issue, and the longer you go without dealing with the issue, the more you avoid. And you're usually avoiding in unhealthy ways because it's such a terrible experience that you'll do anything to avoid it.
Okay. Um, I was looking at some articles talking about MDMA being used to like assist in psychotherapies. I
Yes.
read some stuff about the FDA talking about the risk to benefit ratio, and that's something that I've never really known much about. Like if that is a treatment that's being used to help people deal with different things.
Yes, I think it's mostly done in Europe, but I think there's some experimentation in the States. But basically, it's working on parts of the brain that allow you, because this would be along with therapy, to make it easier to approach things that are fearful or triggering is usually the word we use by something that if you think of a trigger on a gun, it's pulled and that's it. It's automatic. There's no thinking involved. So for a combat vet, if they see a scene from a war movie, for example, that could cause such a great release of adrenaline that again you bypass your thinking and you'll start to react in a very dysfunctional way. So it happens so quickly that the person doesn't have time to think about it. So that's why I call it a trigger. It bypasses the higher brain and puts your body into a fight or flight or freeze response.
So is this the same idea with cannabis being used for treatment? It's used to open somebody up to thinking about the problems in a different way or a different angle?
Well, the experience that I've had, and it's been the anecdotal um, accounts of people that have been using medical marijuana, is that they find that it takes the sharp edges off of some of their thinking. Some research that's been done in the States shows medical cannabis can reduce the intensity and frequency of nightmares in people with PTSD, which is really an important uh, effect because you need to sleep, have refreshing sleep in order to have your body recover. But when you have PTSD, nightmares very often are included. They're very often violent dreams, and so waking up throughout the night, not getting rest. Um, that that's why in the States it is commonly prescribed for veterans to receive medical cannabis because it really does seem to work. And again, along with psychotherapy, because it is going to bring emotions to the surface, but not in the same mechanism that alcohol does. So there's less concern, and that's why there's been a lot of research, and it is commonly prescribed for PTSD in the States and even in Canada. That there are veterans that do have that prescription.
Does the route of administration matter when you're using cannabis for that type of thing? Like, is it more beneficial to to eat it? Is it more beneficial to inhale it? Is there a better or worse option?
Uh, as far as I know, the research isn't there yet. I think that it's whatever the person is most comfortable with. Um, but I don't know of any research that has shown um, which is most effective. A lot of it is the stigma that even though it might be prescribed by a physician who specializes in the area, um, the wife or boyfriend might not, might still have that stigma of this being um, a bad thing to do, even though it's legal that the person is using it because they have a prescription. If it was Prozac, they might say, well, that's okay. But because if it's medical cannabis, then there's still the relationship, almost like a reefer madness kind of
Yeah.
belief that this is a bad drug, when in fact it has been very therapeutic. When you hear the veterans that I work with who have that prescription, that they they find it such a relief. But I know with one person I'm working with that he still needs to sneak outside because his wife doesn't really approve of it, even even though it's prescribed by a physician. It's just that idea.
Yeah, it's a hard stigma to shake. What is typically given to treat PTSD? Like, is it still predominantly like pharmaceutical drugs prescribed?
Yes, and the is there really isn't one effective approach in treating PTSD. And what they typically do is they'll treat the symptoms. So if someone's having trouble sleeping, they'll try sleeping aids. If they're having panic attacks, they might provide the proper antidepressant or anxiety medication. Um, but there isn't like the standard, oh, you have PTSD, we need to get you on this and this. It would depend on the person that's prescribing and what they believe is effective.
I was looking through like what the like diagnosis for major depression is because I was trying to see if I could find what they would prescribe for PTSD. Um, and is that something that people with PTSD commonly get diagnosed with? It seems like a lot of the symptoms of PTSD could kind of be related to depression as well.
Um, Well, PTSD has a number of symptoms. It used to be referred to as post-traumatic stress syndrome, a syndrome being a number of different disorders. So, with PTSD, we'll also see panic attacks, or they might not have panic attacks. There can be depression, and that would be the diagnosis would be post traumatic stress disorder with depression. But PTSD would be the predominant diagnosis because that also is affecting you more than, say, just a depressive illness. Another aspect is something called dissociation, where the person doesn't feel that they're actually in their body, that they will feel removed from their body, and that could be looked at like an out of body experience, or looking in the mirror and not recognizing yourself, which is called depersonalization. And dissociation, men could be that you're just sitting there looking out the window and engaging in what we call emotional numbing. I'm not even aware of my feelings. I'm just staring off into space, and I'm kind of out of my body right now. So it can come up in a number of different ways. And to assess it, I use um, the MMPI, which is a personality inventory that measures the health, emotional health of the individual across the board. And there's a certain pattern of results that you see with PTSD than, say, if someone was very depressed because of a traumatic incident, someone close to them dies, they may have a normal grieving response and feel some depression, but it's clearly, not post-traumatic stress disorder because there are a number of criteria that need to be met, which you don't see in depression. So it would be quite different. So you would be able to see where the depression, how the depression affects the person, but there would be a lot of other symptoms as well.
Okay, so depression could be like a part of PTSD, but not be the entire thing.
Right, right. And same thing with anxiety. As I say, social anxiety, especially because you see the person doesn't want to go out because they're feeling, often people will feel like they're a failure because they have this, or a weakness, or they're cowardly, and it has nothing to do with that. It's happening at, we call it a subcortical level, below the higher level of the brain. There's your animal brain, your reptilian brain, it's called by different things, which is not smart. It's not the smart part of the brain. It's reacting, as I said, on a switch. Is there danger? Is there no danger? The higher brain is the part that says, no, there's no danger as long as you do this, this, and this. Everything's fine. Don't worry about it. That takes about 15 milliseconds to get that higher level of thinking, and it takes 5 milliseconds for you to, say, identify there's a bear and have the physical response, but it takes an additional 10 milliseconds, which isn't a long time, to realize I need to get out of here. But if the initial response is that strong, as I said, you get this amygdala hijacking, which shuts off access to the higher brain and puts the response into the larger muscles, like your arms and legs, to either fight or flight, get out of there or fight. And because there's no real reasoning at that point, the anger or the negative emotions comes out as rage. And some people that I've worked with have actually described it as all they do is see red. They just get so angry, and they watch themselves going through this anger and not being able to stop it. So it's like you're watching yourself, and that's part of the dissociation, the break between the higher brain, the higher evolved brain, and the lower brain that we share with other mammals.
Would would damage to the brain make somebody more susceptible to PTSD? So with like veterans coming back and having experienced maybe like concussive blows caused by explosions, or just any type of concussion, would that leave them more susceptible to experience something like that?
Yes, there are certain variables that will make the prognosis worse, a more severe PTSD, for example, if there's blood involved, if there's a death, if you get blood on you from somebody else who's, say, suffered a traumatic in war, someone is killed beside you, you could develop post-traumatic stress disorder because you're dealing with a traumatic event, someone dying. So if there's blood, if there's a death, as I said, so there's a number of variables that will, when you hear that, how long it's been since the event happened. So different variables will predict the prognosis. So often if you can get in there quickly, it prevents the belief that there's, well, a lot of people will think I'm just going crazy, or maybe I become schizophrenic, or things with a much different treatment approach. So again, if you're living for years, keeping it to yourself and thinking, I don't want to talk about it, which is what happened after the Second World War with the idea of people having, there was a different name for it in the Second World War. So it progressed every time, trying to make it less of a stigma, but there was still the idea of being, you couldn't take it, you couldn't handle it, almost like a weakness, which isn't the case. It's no indication of weakness. It's the idea that your nervous system is not cooperating with the rest of your brain, and it would need to reduce that extra stimulation, but also to get at the idea that this means that you're weak, and that stronger people wouldn't have suffered this, which really isn't true, because in order to not feel it, you would pretty much have to not care about other people. For example, like if I don't care what happens to other people, well, it doesn't bother me if I kill them. But if you do have that kind of compassion, but you're in a situation where you experience a traumatic event, then it will likely hit you harder, because you're acting in ways that you don't like. Like, why am I so angry at that person that cut me off? I wanted to, get out of the car and pound them. And this is a person that's, normally very peaceful. But it's just, when you get that fight or flight, it's, like your pet dog could love you, but if the dog is very hungry and you go to take the bowl away, they might try to bite you, even though they don't normally act that way. But it's just an instinct that someone is doing this to me. So you react very quickly, even though, as I say, in hindsight, you would say, why did I do that?
Would you say that some of these misconceptions lead to it being underdiagnosed?
Yes, I think there's been a reluctance to diagnose PTSD because there was still the idea that it could only happen to combat veterans, someone that's experienced combat. And it's often looked at as, it might be labeled as anxiety or depression. But again, if you look for some of the, call them the hallmark symptoms of PTSD, such as a loss of touch with reality, in the sense of, as I said, dissociation, suddenly developing a lot of rage, again, because the adrenaline is not going in the right place. The adrenaline is going to the large muscles to either get you out of there or to defend yourself, or to freeze if you don't know what to do. And the person is just locked, like they don't know what to say, what to do. And so without therapy, people will tend to think that they're seriously, and it is a serious disorder, but they'll think that, I'm crazy and I don't want to talk to anybody about it because I don't want anyone to find out that I keep having these, what can appear like hallucinations, seeing the person that, say, abused you 20 years ago, now you suddenly think you see them everywhere. And it sometimes comes up when the person, if we look at say, sexual abuse, when they might read in the paper that this person died that abused them, that might be the first time they start to deal with it. So they've done such a good job of suppressing it that when something comes out of the blue and triggers it, then it can hit you like it just happened. And that confuses a lot of people. Is this happened 20 years ago? And family and friends are more likely to say, just let go of it. It happened 20 years ago. But to your physiology, it just happened.
Would that be something like having a repressed memory, or is that a different thing altogether?
Um, well, you could call it a repressed memories because you haven't been dealing with it. But usually when they talk about repressed memories, they're talking about um, uh, different aspects of, for example, somebody accusing somebody of sexual abuse that they've been holding back for years, but there's no sign of trauma. So there's a lot of debate over that idea of repressed memories, um, because sometimes you can develop anxiety or an anxious response if a therapist or a friend brings up a past experience that was troublesome. There could be a period of time that the person remains anxious, but you don't see the major symptoms of PTSD, like continual flashbacks, feelings that you are actually back in the situation. Um, there's a number of um, symptoms. Emotional dysregulation is the one I refer to, whereas before you had a dial for your emotions. That was only about a 4 that person said that, or the person cut me off, maybe a 6. Now it's a switch. They're okay, or that person needs to suffer my wrath because they insulted me by cutting me off. And it happens very quickly.
Okay. Well, Dr. Shore, you've answered all the questions and more that I could even think of. Is there anything that you'd want people to know about your field? Like, is there anything that you think people might not know, people might be interested to know?
Um, I think that it can happen in a number of situations that people wouldn't normally expect it. Like, for example, with sexual abuse or spousal abuse can result in post-traumatic stress disorder. Um, and people are often not aware of that. In the case of spousal abuse, it's that your most trusted friend is also your abuser. So a nervous system um, has a great deal of difficulty adapting to that. So if the person that you're dependent on is also the one that's triggering you, it's very hard to get treatment, because that would be it wouldn't be hard to pick up in an assessment that that's what's going on, and then that introduces other issues. So friends will often grow impatient, and say, well, then just leave him or her. And it doesn't work that easy, because the trauma is also, in that case, is getting you to be dependent on the person that's your abuser. So it can take on a number of different forms, but probably one of the biggest is to not expect that someone who's been diagnosed with PTSD is going to get over it within a certain time frame. It's very hard to tell. It can last weeks, months, in some cases years, depending on the variables of how quickly did they get into therapy, was it proper therapy, what's the social support like this, are they, is the state of their marriage, say, strong enough, is there a good enough relationship that this person will try to understand what's going on. Because it's hard seeing a person who's always been very gentle is now experiencing violent outbursts. And so it's knowing where it's coming from can help, rather than believing that, well, this person is turned nasty. So that would be, one of the main things, is that not saying, well, aren't you done this yet? It's been long enough, which is something that, I hear quite a bit because it feels like, well, you should be able to control this, just don't do it. But again, your physiology will react before your higher level thinking. So it's kind of like you're running from the bear before you even realize there's a bear there.
Do you think with time people will recognize that it's a legitimate thing? It won't be viewed like it used to be, like something to just like it almost seems like back when it was referred to as shell shock, people expected you just to shake it off. Um,
Yeah.
it,
Or we don't talk about the war, with Uncle Charlie. If it just he's never been the same, but we don't talk about it. And so, the person just keeps it to themselves because they feel, well, first of all, that no one wants to hear about it, but also even scared to think about it. So they're, again, constantly trying to avoid it. And that's why, let's not talk about it, which is one of the worst things you can do because then you keep it inside and you end up inside your own head. And then you start to believe that you're never going to get better because it just doesn't lift by itself. That um, you need to have some discussion, some plan in place how to deal with these behaviors and thoughts that have never occurred to the person before. Suddenly, they can think about suicide as not being such a horrible option because I don't want to live like this anymore. So again, that's why you want to try to get in there as soon as possible and do what we call psychoeducation. Say this is what's happening to you and this is why it's happening, and then it's less mysterious versus if you keep it to yourself, there's more likely you'll develop those negative self-talk patterns, which I'm weak, I'm a coward, I'm crazy, I'm, those terms that don't help because they undermine your confidence, which leads you to believe, more of those negative thoughts.
what would your advice be to anybody listening that might want to take a first step or see if what they're experiencing did fit into the realm of PTSD or whatever it may be? Like what is the first step for people to take?
Well, I think if you can look online at, there's a lot of very good resources, especially from the veterans in the States, especially. Um, there are links to self assessments on PTSD, but like anything on the internet, go to reliable sources. Um, there's the PTSD Association of United States. That's very good. There's a lot of websites uh, by the different professions. So there's PTSD for police, PTSD for firefighters, and then there's more global. Uh, if you have PTSD, um, the it's very remarkably similar what different causes um, will result in the same symptoms. So somebody who's in combat, a combat veteran, will show a lot of the same symptoms as, say, a paramedic who is at an especially gruesome scene. Um, and oftentimes they can't understand it. I mean, I've been to 50 scenes, some of them worse than this. Why is this one upsetting me? And that could be that a number of reasons. Could be the day, or it could be kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So sometimes it could appear like I don't know why it's happening now. I've had so much worse happen to me. Um, but again, that's normal because it's the nervous system could only handle so much, and now you've gone over into the where it's not operating at its normal level.
Dr. Scholl, Dr. Scholl, this has been fantastic. I've you've really made me think a lot different about PTSD. It seems like it's something that can encompass so many different things and something that's probably uh, a thing that a lot of people are dealing with that may not even know that they're dealing with it or might be embarrassed to say they're dealing with. I think it's fantastic to hear from you just that it is such a normal thing and it is something that you should talk about and you shouldn't be ashamed about and you should let people know so that you can find help for yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This has been
That's
fantastic.
exact. Uh, Happy
Thank
to
you so
help.
much. We appreciate it. I'm sure everyone listening appreciates it. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share this.
Happy to do it anytime.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.